Hello and welcome to Runkle of the Bailey. My name is Ian Runkle. I'm a Canadian criminal defense and firearms lawyer. One thing I see argued a lot online is whether this, being a zip tie, is as good as this, a trigger lock, in terms of legal storage, transport, etc., particularly with respect to restricted firearms. So having a look at the legislation, because that's always a great place to start, we can see the storage, display, transportation, and handling of firearms by individuals regulations. Note, there's different regulations for business, but the relevant section here is the same. So secure locking device means a device, A, that can only be opened or released by the use of an electronic, magnetic, or mechanical key, or by setting the device in accordance with an alphabetical or numerical combination, and, so two components here, that when applied to a firearm prevents the firearm from being discharged. So when we think here, and I have here a Browning Nomad pistol, which is of course unloaded. Always important to play safely with things. But if you take the trigger lock and apply that, and this is always a little awkward when trying to hold it up for a camera. So that fairly effectively prevents this from being fired because now the trigger is inaccessible. However, when we think about this, it's not actually the greatest degree of security, or at least it's not my favorite, because in terms of the actual firing mechanism, it's still open. We've got the magazine well, so you can still put a magazine in it. Similarly, you don't have to use a magazine. You could just manually feed a cartridge into this. The action closes. In theory, this can still go off if it's, for instance, not drop safe, or if somebody manages somehow to wedge something in underneath the trigger lock. So that is not necessarily, it's not 100%, but this is going to be good enough. I don't think I've ever found a case where the court has said, well, your trigger lock is only a trigger lock and it doesn't, block the action. I do prefer a cable lock where it works, but that's just a preference. I own a bunch of trigger locks. I own some cable locks. They both work and they both meet the legal standards. But when we start talking about a zip tie, now a zip tie can work as well or better, because in the case of this Browning pistol, and I'm trying to do this holding it up, which is a very awkward way to do it, but I can sort of draw this here, and there we go. I don't know how much of that was actually caught on camera, but this actually functions quite well in terms of preventing this from being fired. When we think about it here, and you might cut the end off just so you don't have this big floppy end, but it's blocking the trigger from being fired. Now, this is because of the particular design of this particular handgun. Many handguns, of course, a zip tie can fit behind the trigger with no problem. Similarly, if it was a smaller zip tie, the trigger might still be able to be actuated. But it does prevent the action from closing, which means that even if you were to wedge a cartridge in there, you're not going to get from here to bang without disabling this zip tie. Now, the zip tie can be disabled through all sorts of means, but probably the easiest of those would be a knife. I actually find that for dealing with zip ties, toenail clippers work even better. And so once that's off, good to go again. However, when we start looking at things, this definitely meets criteria B. So when applied to a firearm, the zip tie prevents the firearm from being discharged. So that part, we're excellent. Problem is criteria A. That can only be opened or released by the use of an electronic, magnetic, or mechanical key, or by setting the device in accordance with an alphabetical or numerical combination. This, although it's a useful tool, and this, a differently useful tool, are unlikely to be held to be keys. Now, in terms of the practical significance, in terms of the safety of this, I don't think that that the zip tie is any less safe. And further, I don't think that the court is going to be in a very good position to argue that a zip tie is less safe. And the reason why I say that is that if you go into court, and for instance, if this was an exhibit in a court trial, if this was used in a homicide, or if it was found, by somebody who didn't have a license was running around with this thing, the court would zip tie this. They would throw a zip tie on it, and that's how they would indicate that it's been made safe. It's very common that in courtrooms they will use a zip tie for that. However, because it doesn't meet that criteria of only opening with a combination or a mechanical, electronic, or magnetic key, it's quite likely that the court would find that the zip tie does not meet the regulations. And if you remember the Porter decision, and if you haven't watched my video on that, that is the decision where the Mr. Porter had essentially wooden boxes that were screwed shut, but he didn't actually have a lock on the box, just that it was sealed shut. And the court found that that wasn't good enough because a lock was a required element. So if he'd thrown a padlock on top of that, it would have been fine. And the court specifically said, even if your storage is better than what the regulations call for, you still have to meet the regulations. So I don't think that a zip tie is likely to be found by the courts to be sufficient in terms of meeting the regulations. However, if the charge was careless storage, I think that a zip tie properly applied would likely cover off that criteria. However, because the Crown can charge you with either the the not following the regulations or the careless storage, or they can hit you with both, I don't recommend relying on a zip tie as a secure locking device where you need one, legally speaking. Now, that doesn't mean that a zip tie isn't great. I own lots of zip ties. I think they're a great thing because, of course, you can add those additionally if you want to be extra secure. But the place where I find them most useful is when you have the large sort of plastic cases. Often there's 4 locking points. Now, locks, it's a pain to have 4 separate locks on this thing, even if they're key-to-like, even if they're all in the same combination. So I typically like to put 1 lock in. So I've got 1 lock, and then however many zip ties are required. Some cases I have, for instance, 4 points. I've got one that's got 6 separate lockable points. And if you throw a zip tie through each of those, that case is not getting opened easily. And I don't think anyone would be able to give you grief over that storage at that point, because you've got the required lock and you've got the zip ties. So where that's required that it be in a locked case, that can be helpful. Again, not required. These things are not going to be helpful to you at all in terms of meeting the legal requirements per the regulations. But they can be good for going above and beyond, or for enhancing your storage in order to avoid a potential charge of carelessness. Because there are circumstances where you might be meeting the regulations, but still could be considered careless even though that's the case. So that's basically it. If somebody tells you that a zip tie is a secure locking device, that's not my view. I don't think that that is what the court is likely to uphold. In particular, I don't think that a court is going to find that a knife is a mechanical key. I mean, you could maybe swing the argument, but I think it's going to be a bit of a stretch. So it might be something you'd argue if you had nothing else to argue in the court case, but it's not where I'd want to be, certainly. I should also note that when I started making this video, the first place I started was to see if there were any cases on whether a zip tie had been considered as a secure locking device, either to say yes it is or no it isn't. Unfortunately, I couldn't find anything along those lines. All I can find in terms of zip ties and firearms is lots of kidnapping cases where people were using these as a restraint mechanism, but nothing in terms of them being a trigger lock. So this hasn't been decided one way or another firmly by the court. This is just my guess as to how things would be likely to shake out. And hopefully you're not the person that ends up paying for that, because that'd be an expensive court case. Fun for the lawyers, but not so much fun for the person in the accused box. So once again, thank you for watching. If this has been useful, please like the video, share it with your friends, subscribe if you want to see more content. I want to thank my $50 Patreon supporters, George and D. Mo. $30 Patreon supporter Steve Browning, as well as $10 Patreon supporters who will be listed in the crawl immediately following. Thank you, and I hope this has armed you with knowledge.